Yeah, and the very first thing I want to say about the topic itself and also my attitude towards life in general is that I believe that I don't know anything. And the older I get, and some of you there, like, we have very young people here, but once you get to a certain age, you realize you really don't know shit, right? and and But the interesting thing is that I have always had this idea that there needs to be something that I'm sure of, so that I can actually start doing something, or even anything. But there needs to be something that I believe in, or some sort of starting point. And this um, I think Stanley Jordan is going to join us now. Yeah, Stanley. I'm not sure if he's here. I can't see him yet. Yeah, I don't know, but anyway. So what I wanted to say is, like the starting point is always like I have no idea. Ah, there's Stanley. Stanley, wonderful to see you.
Thank you.
Hey, very very good to have you here as a very unexpected special guest, and maybe like the number one specialist for what we want to talk about. I actually feel guilty that I have never spoken to Stanley before, because I'm sure he would have saved me decades of practice or of research, let's say. I just watched a video of you again, like from 1990 or something, and it's just unbelievable, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So if it's okay with you, Stanley, may I also interview you tonight or today?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. So because I just said this at the beginning, that really this is not about the history of the touch guitar or whatever. It's just like my personal account of what I encountered, and like what my path was, and what I saw, and like the problems I ran into and the solutions I found. And I would really, because you've been when did you actually start playing guitar?
I started playing guitar in 1971, and I used conventional techniques, and I started doing the touch technique around 76. So
Okay.
I was already, very serious as a pick player on guitar, and
Yeah.
I did some finger style too. I don't think I got real good at it, but I was working on some interesting ideas, and then I realized with the touch technique, I could go farther toward what I was trying to accomplish with fingerstyle.
Yes. And how? So you basically discovered the touch technique via the fingerstyle technique, or was there more to it?
Yeah, there's more to it. I was playing a lot of piano. Piano was actually my first instrument.
Mm-hmm.
And I had stopped playing for several years and I got really serious about guitar. So I knew that I was a guitarist, but I still like some of the possibilities of the piano. So I wanted to find a way to bring those possibilities to guitar. And I remember I was reading a book for pianists, for jazz pianists, and I saw um, uh, like a library of chord voicings.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that if the guitar were not limited to one note per string, then we could play any of those voicings in that book. And then the other obvious thing is only one hand playing notes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I set out to develop an electronic instrument, like a synth controller that was physically a keyboard, but logically like a guitar, because it would be a matrix of push buttons.
Mm-hmm.
And with that instrument, I could play those really rich and interesting piano voicings. And I was only 15 at the time, so I had a lot to learn. From the electronic side, I knew enough about electronics to build that aspect of it, but I didn't know enough about construction, like working with wood, plastics, and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I set out to learn that kind of stuff, And so while I was working on that, I just decided to see, well, how closely can I approximate that idea in the meantime on a normal guitar?
Hmm.
So obviously, I still can't play more than one note on the same string, but maybe I could find a way to do independent hands at least that would
Yes.
get some of that possibility. And so I started really working on it, and I realized that there were some difficulties, and so I started working on how to get around those difficulties. And I spent a lot of time on it and made a lot of progress on that. And and that's when I realized, wow, this is a complete approach to guitar in its own right.
Yeah.
It's separate from normal guitar. It doesn't replace normal guitar techniques, but it is a separate sort of genre of how to approach the guitar. And it's also separate from the idea of the electronic fingerboard. So I just decided to abandon the electronic fingerboard and focus on the idea on guitar. And it was good that I did that because years later, the electronic idea was invented by other people, so I didn't even have to do it.
Yes, yes, yes.
But with the expression of the guitar and being able to control the vibration, being able to actually touch the string, just the expressiveness of
Yeah,
playing.
there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. And you
Right.
can't. And I remember I once had a Starlab Zetar. If you remember,
The
maybe
Zetar,
it
yeah, I
it
still
was
use
like,
it.
yeah, yeah, and it was yeah, it wasn't for me really because it was just a synth. But I'm interested in, were you actually aware of Jimmy Webster when you started with the touch technique, or was that something
No,
you discovered later?
no, I wasn't. In the beginning, I just called it, I don't know, fingerboard guitar.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
there was this music store. I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a music store where I used to play a lot, and I developed a lot of my technique while I was hanging out at this store. And there was a guy who repaired guitars at the store, and he did a lot of work on filing my frets so I could get the action down. And I remember that there was someone at that store who started calling it the the touch technique,
Hmm.
and I really liked that name, so I started adopting that name.
Yeah.
And it was later that I found out that Jimmy Webster had the touch system.
Hmm.
And also, I met someone, Paul Edwards, who was a rep for Stick Enterprises. He
Hmm.
represented the Chapman Stick. I saw an ad about the stick in a magazine, like a guitar player magazine or something. And when I saw the ad, I instantly knew that that was the same technique
Hmm.
that I was using on guitar. So I had been using that technique for about a year up to that point. And excuse me. So then I found out that Paul Edwards was going to be coming to town. So I came. I was there when he came and demonstrated the stick in our store,
Hmm.
and I ended up playing with him and stuff. And he said, "Man, Emmett should hear you. This is really great. You should get a stick." And I was really excited. And then later on, Emmett himself also came to that same store, and he played, and that's where I met him.
Hmm.
And
And did you ever play the stick? I mean, did you own one?
um, no, the stick is so different from how I set up my guitars, and so it's not like I can instantly adapt to the stick. I have some technical issues with it. One is the strings are really close together because they have so many strings on the neck, so
Hmm.
they're really close together, and the frets are really far apart. So I'm
Hmm.
doing a lot of this motion going really far, and then when I get there, I I have to hit so accurately that I almost always hit the wrong string.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then the action, like on especially on the higher strings, the strings are so thin, and that it's the dynamics are very even. Like it's not. I don't find the same dynamic range on the stick that I have on my normal guitars.
Yeah.
So if I hit the wrong note, it comes out as loud as the note that I wanted to hit. And
Hmm.
and so I know it's a question of training. If I had one and I worked on it, then I know that I could get around that. And at one point, I spoke with Emmett on the phone, and I said, "Hey, I have some ideas for how the stick could be improved." And I don't know, maybe I phrased it wrong because really it was just these were ideas for how it would be more adaptable for me, for my own
Yeah, yeah.
approach, you know. But he said, well, no, I think the stick is pretty much perfected. And
Hmm.
so I realized that there wasn't really room at that time for me to suggest any changes in the stick. And I
Hmm.
figured, well, maybe down the road, when his company's more successful, he'll have room to branch out and do more different variations. But now is not the time to talk about any variations.
Yeah.
So then the question was, well, get how can I get one? And so I sent him a letter and I said, hey, I really like the stick. I really like to play it. And he sent me an offer to purchase one, but it was just out of my league. I just didn't have the money.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that's what's that's the first of several times that I kind of made up my mind that I was going to play the stick, and then various obstacles got in the way, some of which I'm not really in the mood to discuss. But it's something that at some point I would like to do. I just haven't gotten there.
Yes, yes. No, I mean from my very own experience, because I played the Chapman stick for 5 years, I think.
Hmm.
There was just the fact of the ergonomics of the instrument itself that I couldn't really. It was just too alien to me, and even the concept of having the fifth and the fourth on the same fretboard. I
Mm.
mean, I was maybe talented enough to deal with it, but I saw so many people hit a ceiling after having an instrument for a week and never get over that ceiling. And that was so frustrating because I liked the idea so much of the technique, and also I thought the instrument was very cool, you know. But then once I had it, it was like a real struggle. And I remember that the very first night I had it, I decided, okay, yeah, I really want to go for it, and I really want to learn this. And I did work with that instrument for like 5 6 years, and at that point, then I realized, okay, no, I need to try something else, and I arrived at an instrument that was more like an electric guitar, and I still play an instrument that's more like that, and I only use 8 strings and stuff like
I
that.
do like the ergonomics of how, with the belt hook, the neck is almost vertical,
Hmm.
and so it balances the hands really well, and that is good. Because if you look at a lot of the tappers on guitar, they're always like this.
Yes, yeah,
And
yeah.
I actually had um, repetitive motion strain,
Hmm.
and I actually had to stop playing for a little while, and I went to a doctor who specializes in performing arts medicine and sports medicine, and he said that I was well on my way to getting tendonitis,
Hmm.
and he said, "Here, I'm going to videotape you for a while, and I want to make some suggestions." So he turned on the camera, and I started playing, and he said, "Okay, that's enough." And I was like, "Well, I haven't even really started yet." He said, "No, I've already seen enough. Let me tell you what you're doing wrong." And he gave me a whole list of things that I was doing wrong from a physical ergonomics point of view,
Hmm.
and that pretty much saved my career. I mean,
Hmm.
because one of the things he pointed out is he said the wrist, this bend in the wrist, should not be more than like about 15 degrees,
Hmm.
because there's a sheath like a tube. The tendon goes inside a tube, and when your wrist is bent, then the tendon scrapes the inside of the tube, and
Hmm.
it wears it out. And so that was one of the problems.
Hmm.
The other thing is he said that when you're if you can have the neck more up, and if you can have the instrument farther away from your body, and he said keep this shoulder down no matter what. And he said if you can play like this, it's better. And I said, well, I have to go like this, so I can have more speed on my runs. And he said, okay, so anytime you don't have to have your hand like this, put your hand like this as much
Hmm.
as possible.
Hmm.
And then he said, don't be afraid to change your whole body position, like just to play one lick, so that you're not forcing your hands and wrists to do all the work. So align your whole body in a different way. just to play that one thing. You know, don't be afraid to do that. It'll make for a better performance anyway. You know.
Stanley, I love you. That's amazing. It's amazing that what you're telling us here, because I have been preaching the same thing for 2 decades now,
Wow.
and it really is, for me, it's still so sad that many people don't really know about these basic ideas, and just to make, and I found that the one of the problems I've ran into with the stick was that it was too fixed on the body. It didn't really kind of move with me. It didn't allow me to kind of change the position, and so I think that in addition to the body being something that kind of should always adjust to the situation you're in, even if it's just one lick, like you say,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also that the instrument should be able to move a little bit.
Yeah.
So, like you're saying, the instrument should be forward rather than on your chest.
Mm-hmm.
And that the problem there is that people like usually rely so much on the visual of
Mm-hmm.
seeing the fretboard that something like the stick where it's fixed in front of your body is very attractive, because it seems like it makes it easier for you to play the right notes.
Mm-hmm.
But it just is such a difficult thing to handle for the body. And like I said, I like the idea so much. I was so happy that I discovered this stick. It was just pure chance, and just like for many people, I had heard of you actually before even hearing of the stick.
Mm-hmm.
But I did. What really made it click for me was hearing Tony Levin with King Crimson.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
it's
Uh-huh.
like that for many people. And anyway, so really, does anybody have questions for Stanley? Stanley actually said to me today, he sent me a link that he's actually doing a course on which, like, one chapter of it will be about the touch technique. Is that
Uh-huh.
correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to be teaching on Zoom, and the workshop has 6 sessions. So the first session is coming up this coming Saturday. So it's going to be 6 Saturdays, and we're covering. I identified 6 things that I think are the most important components of what I do, and so we're going to do it like an intensive day on each one. So this coming Saturday, we're talking about my learning method. I call it integral optimization. And we're also doing a day on the touch technique. We're doing a day on the P4 tuning. We're doing a day on what I call the Jordan chromatic system, which is based on integer pitch class notation, but it's sort of
Hmm.
my own development of that. And so it's sort of a more mathematical way to think about music theory.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to do a day on jazz harmony and melody, and then a day on improvisation. So this is the first time I've done anything like this, so I'm really excited about that. So we can send a link if anyone wants to find
Yes.
out more
Yes.
about that.
So do you also teach private lessons?
Yes, I do. Like many people, I've moved to doing more online teaching, and this is something I've wanted to do all along anyway. It's not like I'm doing it because of COVID, you know. It's like COVID actually gave me the opportunity to put more time into it and finally launch it, you know.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm really most excited about. So I can put, put a link in. It's so my school is called Integral Arts Academy, and I eventually want to branch out besides music. Music is the main focus, but I eventually want to feature all the performing arts and all the arts really as a central way to deal with the world, like a central way of thinking, core methodology. I think artists have all the right ideas about how to approach whatever it is that you want to do, and so it's a bigger idea than just guitar or just music, you know. But that's where it's starting now.
Okay. Does anybody want to ask Stanley a question?
Yeah, Henry, you have a question?
Sorry, can you hear me? Is my audio okay?
Yes, I hear you.
I was wondering if you had practiced any of the Alexander technique to address some of the issues as far as wrist, hands, all of that, shoulders.
Hmm. No, I haven't. It's a great suggestion. I know a little bit about it, and I've had some people show me some things, so I know that it's really good. But I haven't done any kind of serious practice of it, and I'm glad to hear you mention that because it's a good reminder. It's definitely something that I want to do. Thanks.
I have a question I'd like to ask.
Yes.
So you talked a lot about how you felt about the stick. How did you feel about the mirrored string arrangement since you traditionally play like a six-string instrument?
Well, okay. There's the thing I really like about that. You're talking about the tuning of the stick, right? Yeah. So the thing that I really like about it is each side of it is symmetrical. So you got one side in fourths and you got the other side in fifths. And I've used the symmetrical fourths tuning for most of my career. I started doing that a year earlier than I started doing the touch technique. So I'm a big fan of symmetrical tunings already. So I like that aspect of it. And I also like the idea that the bass is in the middle so that either hand can access the bass really easily. Um, I didn't really like the technique, the tuning at first, but when I started to explore it a little bit, I kind of warmed up to it and I grew to appreciate it. Um, it's not how I would have done it, or at the very least, if I were to do that technique or that tuning, what I would do is, okay, in the middle between the two sides, I think it's some kind of a tritone or a compound tritone. There's like a C string and an F sharp string or something
Yeah.
like that. It's like you got all these beautiful fourths and all these beautiful fifths, and then you've got a tritone in the middle. It's like, what's up with that? So I would adjust that so that it's either a fourth or a fifth. Um, but in general, the general concept of it, I think it's I think it's good. It's just not how I would have done it.
Also, have you experimented with fifth tuning on your six-string instrument at all?
I have not experimented with fifth tuning. I think it's for me. I like the small intervals, and I like those like the bebop lines and the tight things you can do with the smaller intervals. I do love big intervals, and but on guitar you can play big intervals. I think even easier than on keyboard. So I already get that. What is really intriguing for me though is thirds, major thirds tuning, symmetrical thirds. I think that is a brilliant idea because it makes the neck even simpler than fourths. It's about as simple as you can get, and it fits very neatly into your fingers, um, with the four fingers, and so you can play an octave straight across without ever having to move diagonally, and an octave would be like three strings over,
Mhm.
and so the patterns just simplify even more. It's like switching from the English system to the metric system, and then finding out that there's something even better than the metric system. Like, wow, that's great. So I would like to do that at some point.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Hmm.
I have a historical observation
Uh-huh.
of mine. You indicated that you started tapping on guitars around 76, 77.
Hmm.
I actually remember you practicing or playing for a group at Princeton outside at the fountain
Oh,
about 78. So it was
uh,
my first time that I saw you, and the sound that you were making was so fantastic. It was really great.
thank you.
I just wanted to throw that in there because obviously it was certainly at the beginning of your tapping technique or somewhere in some development of it. And
Hmm.
even at that point, you were sounding amazing. So I just wanted to appreciate having
Yeah,
encountered you then and encountering you now again.
doing it for a couple of years at that point. Wow. And it was nice. I have so much nostalgia for those days because the fountain was like a beautiful place that people would hang out in the summer and stuff, you know. And there was kids waiting in the fountain and stuff. People were everywhere, and the way that the building behind it was built, the sound would go up, and then it would echo in the columns, and it would go out across the other buildings and go all the way out to Nassau Street. So people told me that they were all the way out on Nassau Street and they heard the guitar and they came to the fountain. And it was
Yeah,
just on a little battery-powered mouse amp.
yeah. That's the other thing I remember was just a little amp, and you were just sitting in the corner of the on the one of the stone benches or something, and just
Uh-huh.
just playing away.
Uh-huh.
It was a great time.
Wow. I appreciate it. I'm happy to answer questions. I know, Marcus, you had a lot of things you wanted to talk about, and I don't want to take up the.
Well, this is so much better than I could have hoped for. Like to have you around, and I certainly want to connect after this, and I will ask you for a couple lessons.
Oh, sure. I listened to some of your music that's online too, and I really enjoyed it. And in particular, I really like how you explore some of the more interesting, like not mainstream harmonies, but you do it in such a natural way. It's not like you're trying to show us how smart you are or whatever.
Hmm.
You're just hearing some other colors, and you're just gently leading us into these other worlds, and I really enjoy that.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, yeah. For me, I'm not a natural born player. I'm just a music lover, and I wanted to just create sound worlds, and through these like series of events, I ended up uh, playing the stick and then the war guitar, and then kind of later on, my own design, and so but it's always been in order to create music. I was never interested, and I never felt like really deeply involved with the aspect of being an inventor or an explorer, really. It was just in order to make music. So even though I had been practicing technique and polyrhythms and blah, 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 and playing fast even 25 years ago, when I started out releasing a solo album, it was an ambient album with, just very slow notes. But I believe that a good technique really leads you to have a really, you're really able to play one note and really mean it. And that's what music for me is all about. And it was only recently that I released like really the first album where I was playing something that is like more like jazz guitar, let's say, like soloing and showing what I can, like showing off where I've gotten with my practice. And it's for me, it's never been like natural to show that side of myself. Um, but I find it so interesting because the touch instrument, and this is something that you mentioned, like you put that one finger on the string, and there is no need to pick the note with the other hand. You
Yeah.
can, but you don't have to. But that means that this intention, or like the whatever emotion you have in that moment where you play the note, it directly translates into the string. There's nothing in between.
Hmm.
And that has been so extremely wonderful for me to to really like I like I like synthetic soundscapes, but I don't like doing them with synthesizers.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I find the touch instrument is ideal for that, because you really have that immediate connection to the note that's kind of electrically transferred through a cable, then maybe a few pedals or whatever, and to an amp, and that has been so incredibly beautiful. But it has also been frustrating because it does, as you said, it's like an extra technique that does not replace regular guitar playing, and it is quite limited in its expressive range, let's say. Even in the dynamic range, it's much more limited than picking or fingerstyle. However, I find that the resolution playing touch style is incredibly fine, And I don't know if you would agree to that, Stanley, but this is kind of like the impression that I've had from the very beginning, that it's so sensitive somehow that it really is like an ideal carrier for I don't know which word to use here, for musical intention, maybe.
Mm-hmm. When I'm doing my exercises, um, I like to play things at different dynamics,
Hmm.
and so I'll play along at a mezzo forte, then I'll drop down to a piano, but then I try to get in between, like what's in between mezzo forte and mezzo piano, or between mezzo piano and piano, and at every dynamic, if you can consistently stay at that level, then the instrument has a whole character
Hmm.
at each dynamic level. And so it becomes not even so much as selecting the different levels of loudness. It's bringing out different characters of the instrument, and it's tricky. You know, it's I find it's more. I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but you know how they say like the devil is in the details.
Yes.
There's kind of more devil in the details
Yes.
because like I could wake up one day and all of a sudden I just can't freaking do it. What's wrong? Why am I playing so badly today? And I was playing just fine yesterday, and then I figure out that it's a little bit colder today, and my strings have gone just a little bit up from the neck. I
Hmm.
can't even see the difference.
Hmm.
But when I try to play, it doesn't quite feel the same. So I got to go back and maybe adjust my action or get used to where the strings are now. It's a different approach at this level. Okay, now I know what the problem is. There's always something like that. Or maybe the strings are just a little bit too old, with the
Hmm.
finger style or with pick style. The strings last longer. I mean, yeah, they lose their tone, but I can still play the instrument. But when I'm using the touch style, when the strings start getting old, I can't even. They just don't. It just doesn't work anymore like it used to. There's just so many things like that.
You're absolutely right. Let me tell you a little story from my first year of playing the stick. I went to a seminar in Belgium, and I was very lucky that Jim Lampy and Frank Jolliffe were teaching there.
Oh,
Two really nice people and
I
great
met
musicians.
Frank back in the day when I was a street musician in New York.
Yeah,
I have
Frank.
some memories of him playing outside.
He was such a wonderful man, and he taught me so much. But it was particularly Jim Lampy who had like some idea and some considerations about technique, and he showed me everything he knew. But when it came to a question as simple as something that you just mentioned, dynamics, there was nobody who who wanted to give me an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Like people were always talking about playing hard or something but really, and then for me it occurred to me like, okay, it's so simple. In order to play, like the difference between a loud and a soft note is the speed of the fingers, actually the velocity of the finger. And that is something that I have to say, really, I couldn't find that information anywhere.
Oh, uh-huh.
And just I'm pretty sure had I talked to you, you would have been able to verbalize that. But nobody else was able to verbalize that. And in a way, I got very inspired just from these basic ideas. I wanted to be able to start a note. I wanted to be able to stop a note. So both, because the beginning and the end define the note,
The
right?
cutoffs can be tricky too,
Exactly.
like
And
cutting off without buzzing.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's become one of the main things I focus on in my technique and in my teaching.
Oh,
And dynamics are the other aspect, to actually realize that you have to learn to accelerate your fingers at different speeds in order to play dynamically. And you have to accelerate them at different speeds, but still in time. That was just an incredible insight. And then basically, starting from these observations, I developed my own technique and my system
Well,
of playing.
there's another aspect. I know you've run into this too. So, in order to get a good tone, because the tone comes from the string hitting the fret.
Mhm.
So, if you have like little skinny little shaved down frets, it's not going to sound that good. So, it's like those big jumbo frets. Those are the ones that are going to give you that good tone. But then once the frets are big enough to give you that good tone, then it's almost like a scalloped fingerboard.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
so when you play louder, you're bending the string, so the
yes,
pitch goes up. So you kind of have so when you're tuning the instrument, you kind of have to know like what dynamic range you're going to be playing in, so that the instrument can be in tune at that dynamic range. There's
exactly.
just so many things like
Yes,
that. It's
yes,
crazy.
and even on that in that first seminar I went to in '93, I saw people play like really like Bach and Mozart on stick,
Hmm.
and it was impressive, but it didn't sound good,
Mm.
and that was just utterly disappointing to me. And there were people who had been playing for a long time already, then like 20 years, and the notes were still out of tune, and I was saying, okay, this can't be it. There must be a way. And back then I had already listened to your playing, and I realized, I mean, Stanley can do it on a guitar, so why can't you do it on a stick? And at that time, several other instruments, touch instruments, turned up. I like the Mobius guitar, maybe was one of the first, and the war guitar, and somehow the issue, I think it got a little better, but it's still not solved, and that has always been like a real source of frustration to me.
Hmm. I think um, I think that maybe one thing that Emmett did in the design of the stick is he really wanted to make the instrument easy to play. He wanted to make it easy to get a tone,
Hmm.
and he really succeeded at that. I mean, with a lot of guitars, just normal guitars, and I try to play them touch style. One of the typical things that happens is that the high notes don't come out strong enough. Um, but the stick never has that problem. The high notes are so easy to get like a really, you know,
Hmm.
loud tone on. But there's a common thing with so many musical instruments where the thing that makes it easy to play also tends to make it not sound as full.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, and so I think that the stick doesn't have the range, the dynamic range of a normal guitar. From my limited experience, I don't feel it does. Partly because of the thinness of the strings. Like I tried, like he goes down to a seven, a point double oh seven for I think two of the strings, and I tried that for a while on my guitar. My first five strings were like the treble strings of the stick, and then I put another whatever. And I tried that for a while, and I loved how easy it was to play, but I lost a lot in terms of my tone and my
yeah, yeah.
dynamics.
It's the string tension. If the tension gets too low, it's again, we have another factor here. Now it's the tension, right? And you have
But
this.
I do think he gets some of that back because he's got a long scale length, and
Mhm.
so you need more tension just because of that. So he
Yes.
gets back some of that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
still, to me, it's not the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's just see if anybody has more questions for us. Yeah, Nick, please go for it.
Hey Marcus, hey Stanley. Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, I had a question that actually kind of builds on the topics or you guys were just discussing about not just the mechanism for playing the instrument, but also the sound that you get out of it. And Marcus, specific to your point about making music versus making a particular instrument to sing, if you will. And let me just phrase it this way. So, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past as well. How do you find that you can translate instrumental parts to the touch technique that aren't initially for the touch technique. And I'll give you a little bit of a background. So I play jazz bass a lot, and I'm always thinking kind of in the sense of a jazz bassist. But when I want to go to one of my touch instrument, which is a war guitar in this case, I may still be stuck in that mode of thought, or maybe even I just want to try a different song that I've already played on the bass guitar or the upright or something on the touch instrument. How do you find that you can translate that tonal interpretation or that idea into a new instrument? It's really something I've struggled with a lot, and has always kind of pushed me back to the bass rather than to my war in some instances, because I want to play it, but it's not necessarily the right sound I'm hearing in my head
Yeah.
coming out of the touch instrument.
I mean,
I hope that captures it in some
yeah, I mean, I would
roundabout way.
love to hear Stanley's response as well, but what I think is like if you hear it differently in your head and you have the bass guitar that can do that sound, then why would you want to use the touch instrument? Okay, so that's one response. But the other response is that I think that the main problem or the main misunderstanding is that people still think that the touch technique is comparable to a regular guitar or bass style playing where you're using two hands to produce the notes. And that's just not the case. So that means if you want to translate a part to the touch instrument that wasn't written for it, then what you got to do is you got to rethink the part, and it needs to become something else. You can't really try to play it with the hat on that a guitar player would have. And in a way, like, because Stanley is still, or he is using a fourth tuning, so he's relatively close to the guitar, but like I'm just using like this open fifth tuning, like an open C tuning, and it really requires a completely different approach. Where, like, the way that I think about it now is that I'm not even thinking in terms of like individual hands anymore, but the two hands becoming one big hand with 8 fingers, where you can kind of like adjust the spacing between the hands. That gives you different relationships between the notes that the hands can cover, and so in order to replicate a bass part, you on a touch instrument you always need to take into account both hands, and that's something that really needs to be practiced to even think that way. That it's not something that you can necessarily play with one hand. Again, Stanley uses the guitar scale, right? But if you go to the bass guitar scale, like the sticks and the other some other touch instruments, then it's quite a different technique, and you kind of have to really switch to the idea of using two hands to play one part well. And for me, that was a revelation, going from the 10-string or 12-string instrument to the 8-string instrument, where I didn't feel like I had to play two parts at the same time. It's still possible, but it wasn't just musically inspiring to me anymore to do two parts at the same time. I had just joined a band back then in '96 called Europa String Choir, and was with two guitarists and a viola player and me on war guitar back then. And it was just such a wonderful experience to make music with these people. And I was just contributing my part. And I decided if my part was just a bass part, or if it was like a little melody with bass notes underneath or whatever. I had free rein to design these my parts. And it was just so liberating. And it really made me appreciate the sound and the quality of what I could actually create. I think because it's a new thing, it's in a way limited compared to the traditional styles. It really makes sense to approach it from what it is, rather than trying to do something with it that it's not. And having
Follow up. Sorry, Marcus.
Yeah.
Quick follow up though. So when you were playing with an ensemble, did you still think in kind of the functional terms of an ensemble, such as, I'm the tenor part, or I'm the baritone part, or I'm the alto part, or what have you, versus I'm playing a touch guitar.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking in terms of register.
Okay, that's really cool.
And it was really what was really interesting about that is that I figured out and I learned then that like the middle range register, so the one octave above the lowest note of the bass guitar, that was the register that really was the one that spoke to me most. And funny thing was that obviously from there you can go up and you can go down, and that was really like the starting point of the style that I developed and like these solo pieces that I played in the late 90s. So kind of exploring, you could say, really like the guitar range of the touch instrument that also has lower notes. So I understand your frustration that it's kind of hard to sometimes translate what you hear on the touch instrument, but I can also say that it's just a matter of experience. And I see Mr. Lloyd there, for example. He's a good example. He's a bass player who started playing touch guitar last year, and he's gotten really the hang of it very quickly. It's kind of interesting how it's really, I just think it's not necessarily a long learning process. Sometimes it's just like one little switch that needs to be flicked, and for some people it's very easy to flick that switch, and others need a lot of work, like running around that switch for 5 years, and then you're kind of like and then it's flipped, right?
I have thoughts about how easy it is, but yes, thank you. Actually, I have a quick thought about the bass parts too, because when I'm doing bass parts, I don't try to play the touch guitar like a bass, but what I really try to do is, what I really try to do whenever I'm doing anything is I try to listen. And it's not so much trying to exactly reproduce the feeling. It's not trying to reproduce the exact part and the exact sound, because, it has a smaller dynamic range. But within that range, I find it is much, much more expressive because of the way you have to control the release of the note, the way you have to control the touch of the note. And what I try to do is just sort of get the feeling of it. So when I listen back, I kind of think, because I will reproduce my bass parts and I'll go back and listen, and I'll think to myself, is the feeling the same? So it's the difference between taking two kinds of artistic impressions of the same thing, a black and white photo, a painting, a color. You want to reproduce the essence of it, or the feeling of it, without necessarily getting into, oh, it doesn't sound exactly like that. That's kind of the way I approach it.
Yes, and there's also an aspect to it that just comes to my mind that I hardly ever talk about, and I don't think I've ever talked about this to my students at all. But it's a big difference actually playing your instrument through a real amp, like playing the touch guitar through a bass amp. What happens is, because you're kind of like getting so attuned to the fact that you're producing that note with just that one finger, it's almost as if your finger develops this kind of sensation that feels like listening, that feels like hearing the note physically on your skin. And that can distract you from actually hearing what comes out of the amp. So maybe it still feels like it's kind of metallic, or the attacks aren't quite right to get that feel of that shuffly eighth bass note or whatever rhythm. And so I find it's very important to actually record yourself playing parts and then listen back to them. And this is true for every instrument. And you will be surprised that when you listen back to it, when you allow yourself to distance yourself from what you played and you listen back, you will actually hear that things are not quite as they were when you were playing, and things may sound much better than you think. And that has been an insight, that has been like a big tool for me. I actually went out and bought a DAT machine in '94 or something, because I realized I need a professional device to record my playing so that I can listen back to it. And I made a practice out of that. So I improvise every night, and then the next morning or the next day after, I listened back to what I played the night before, and it was just so incredibly useful. And that was the time when I discovered like this main problem that people have with the end of the note, like taking the finger of the string and like the whole instrument starts vibrating and you hear the open strings that are dampened, but you still hear them. And this is important. So Nick, so this just as a suggestion. I know that you've done it, but maybe you should need to do it more. Play your war guitar through an amp at rehearsals and make recordings and really judge after you've played, and don't think so much about it before you actually try it in the rehearsal room.
I think that's a good point. I mean, I have to draw the parallel to writing, which is my day job. I'm an editor. Um, if I'm writing something creatively, I might hate it as I write it. I might think it's the worst piece of creation I've ever uh, put to paper. But if I wait on it for a week or 2 weeks or a month or listen late or look at it later, I might love it and say, "Wow, I actually thought of that." I guess the same holds. I never thought to do that for music. I don't know why. Possibly because I'm so used to playing with other people in a live setting or what have you. Um, but I have to try that now because I'm really curious.
Yes.
There's a distraction that you get when you're in the moment of performing something. And I'm an artist as well as a musician, so this applies to both disciplines. But in the moment of doing something, you can be distracted by what your brain perceives as an imperfection. Like, for example, grabbing that you can feel in your fingers that you haven't grabbed the note properly. But if you come back to it and listen to it later, you'll realize there was nothing wrong with the way the note sounded.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of what you're both describing.
Yes.
And actually, as an addendum to what I said earlier, when I talk about recreating the feel and being very careful, I'm actually talking about listening to the recording. I'm not talking about thinking, oh, in the moment, this is, oh yeah, it feels like that. I never do that. The band I was in for ages and ages ago with Hacksaw, we recorded every single rehearsal for years. And boy, I'll tell you, we got good fast because you think, oh, wow, that song sounds great. And you listen to it later and you're like, oh, no, it really doesn't. We made all of these mistakes. And so I keep doing that. So when I talk about judging the stuff, I'm always talking about a recording later. I've learned I can't do it in real time.
Hey, so Stanley, you have always, well, not always, but you've played with bass players quite a bit, right?
Yes. So much of what you guys are saying is resonating with me. Man, where do I begin? Okay, this recent thing about recording, that is very useful. One thing I've found is, okay, it takes a lot of focus in order to play. And if you're using a technique like touch, so everything is so precise, so it takes so much focus to actually do it. And so a lot of your brain processing is involved in making the sound. And so how much is left over to actually hear the sound? We assume that we listen while we're playing, but I don't think most of us do that as well as we think we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so the nice thing about recording is you can be a pure listener, and then you can really hear what you actually did. And for me, I could be pleasantly surprised in both directions, because maybe the feeling was great, but it didn't translate to recording, man. Or I thought it sucked, and then I go back and I listen, like, wow, that actually sounded good. So I do think that's a really valuable way to practice. Another thing, just talking about raw, I think it was Nick who was talking, maybe it was Nick, you're talking about the role that the instrument plays in an ensemble. And I think depending on how you approach it, you might have to rethink the role. And so, like, for example, if you're doing touch style and you have a lot of independent parts, then your role is going to be more like a piano player. And so you maybe, while you're doing that, you should think of yourself as a because what would that conversation be if there were two pianos? very often it's the same thing anyway with guitar and piano. We need to talk about the voicings, about the range, staying out of each other's way and stuff. So I think it can be even more intense when you're playing in independent parts. Um, Another thing is when you're coming from the bass and you're looking to how to play bass. I agree with what Marcus said about the two using the two hands, kind of like vibes. Like you can play a single line by alternating. With the mallets. That approach I find can be really effective with bass because you can attack each note because you're not limited to sometimes re-attacking with the same hand is not so easy, but when you come at it with another hand, you kind of got more energy you can put into it. And I remember one time I was doing a sound check for this gig, and this bass player came up to me and he said, "Hey," handed me his bass and he said, "I'm a bass player and I'm curious to know like how you would approach the touch technique on bass, because I'm interested in developing that." And I said, "Well, I honestly I haven't given a lot of thought to it. I mean, I play bass lines on my guitar, but I'm not really a bass player. But I've thought about it a little bit. Like if I were a bass player, maybe I do a little bit of this and I do a little bit of that. Maybe I do some alternating vibes type of stuff, for example." And he was like, "Oh, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, cool, thanks." So then years later, I saw him. He became famous. His name was Victor Wooten. So,
Wow, what a
yeah.
story.
So it just goes to show you should always be kind to people. You never
Yeah.
know who you're talking to.
Yes.
But the thing is, okay, there is a difference in sound, and I think Marcus was kind of getting at this too. When like the sound, it may not be suitable for certain things. It's not going to be as deep of a sound, but on the other hand, it might be cleaner and clearer. And so that gives you other possibilities for how it could fit in the ensemble. Like one of the main complaints that people have about me is they say that my tone sounds really thin. And I would say like compared to like your your hollow body jazz guitar through a polytone amp, yeah, it definitely sounds thinner than that. Just like when Coltrane played on the soprano sax, it sounded thinner than when he played his tenor. So sure, I would agree with that, but to me, I don't think that's a bad tone. It's just a different tone, and it depends on the situation whether it's going to fit or not. I really like those bright, sparkly sounds. I like to hear the angels. I like to see the stars in the sound.
Hmm.
And so I love that sound, for that reason. It's my personal taste. And even for regular technique, I love like the Tal Farlow, the Harmonics, and Lenny Breau and all that stuff. Going for that sparkly sound, I just love that.
Yeah.
And there's this is another subject, but there's various ways of getting harmonics with the touch technique. New ways to get harmonics that are opened up. For example, you could do like with one hand I can hold it down, and then no. With this hand I just touch the string, and then with this hand I tap,
Yes.
and so it's an octave away,
Hmm.
and so I can actually play lines with harmonics, arbitrary lines and chords. It's not easy. It's like really super difficult, but it's amazing. The textures you can do with harmonics. So it's just different. Um, I tried these experiments once, and I confirmed it on an oscilloscope, and I had this whole theory. And then recently I tried it again on the scope, and I didn't get the same result. So I'm a little skeptical now. But I'll tell you the theory anyway, and you can
Okay.
explore this on your own. So the idea is, okay, when you play a normal guitar, you're picking the string somewhere kind of near the middle. So you're actually sending out an impulse in both directions along the string. And there's actually two different waves in that same string. And depending on where you play, they're not like totally in phase with each other. And so like when you look at it on an oscilloscope, the wave kind of goes because it's like two different waves kind of phasing in and out of each other. Whereas when you pick near the end of the string or tap on the string, then you're only putting one wave into the string because it's starting from that one end. And so the tone is simpler. It's like ooh, it's just a simple, closer to a sine wave. And so my theory is that it's that it's the sound is simpler not just because there's more high harmonics. It's also because there's only one wave in the string instead of two. And that would also explain why the tone is trickier to mix, because what happens is there's masking effects that can happen because the tone is so pure that another instrument can grab it. Like let's say that the piano plays like an octave lower or something, and all of a sudden your tone just disappears and you
Yes.
become a harmonic of the piano, And so then next thing you know, in order to hear all your notes come through, then you're turning up your volume. So now some of the notes are too loud. And then you're like, well, I can fix that with a compressor. So then you lose your dynamic range.
Yes, yes,
So,
yes. Yeah.
And so this is one of the reasons why I feel like the conventional guitar holds its own in a mix
Yes.
more easily,
Yeah.
Um,
And
well, yeah, go ahead.
let me add something. I think you're onto something there. Like what a similar thought I had was that the initial direction that the string vibrates in is different. Like if you pick it somehow, it starts vibrating this way on the instrument, up and down. But what it goes like this if you tap it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that also the risk of it hitting the frets is much higher as well. So that means that the way you have to set up the instrument, the way that you have to carefully touch, right, is also it becomes part of the attitude even, because you want to make that sound beautiful, and at the same time you're kind of losing the visceral aspect that you get when you're playing with your fingers. Like,
And by the way, on the stick, there's the tone has kind of a buzz, almost like a sitar kind of a buzz, and that's one of my favorite things about the stick. That
yeah,
gentle sort of buzzy
yeah,
sound.
yeah.
So, and just kind of one more thing in that area. When we did my Friends album, um, they mixed it on this really high-end system where it was all digital, like it never even went through the computer. It just went straight to the drive. It was, I don't know. It was sort of excessively what's the word, the, they should have worn lab coats. It's like come on guys, just put the lab coat on. This is what we're dealing with here. But anyway, so the engineer on that session said a really interesting thing, because I was playing an ensemble with a lot of different other musicians on this same record, so you could hear the guitar in different contexts. And the engineer said, one thing that's interesting about mixing your sound is that your sound jumps off of the speaker before all of the other sounds. And so as the engineer, it's creates an interesting challenge for me in how to mix it. And I thought that's really weird, because how could the velocity of one sound coming off the speaker be different from the velocity in the room of other sounds? But that's actually what he told me. And I don't know acoustics enough to explain how that would work, or if that's even what's actually happening. But I would say that I think he's getting at something, because I think that at least what I'm pretty sure does happen is that the time that it takes for your brain to decode what that pitch is coming from touch guitar is really fast. There's probably few instruments out there where your brain can so quickly decode what the pitch is. And I think that it might be a psychoacoustic effect
Yes.
as opposed to an acoustic effect. And so that really would affect like how you'd mix it, because it's going to tend, even if you play at the same time as the other instruments, it's going to sound earlier,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. It's the so-called transient of the note,
Yeah.
like the
So
fast
like on the old
spike.
voltage converters for synth guitar, I always found that they were responding faster with touch guitar because you didn't have that attack on the pick.
Yes.
So it didn't have to wait till the attack is over. It just goes right to the pitch.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that affects, I think, your perception of the timing because I think your ear is able to discern the timing of the note more accurately than almost any other instrument. And so if people accuse you of having bad time, and then you listen to the sax player, like listen to the sax player. The sax player's all over the place, and nobody's complaining because it's a different tone and it has a slower attack, and so the ear is much more forgiving in terms of the critical thinking of the timing.
Yes, exactly. And I think that a lot of talk that people do about playing after or before the beat, actually in reality, it is this transient that we're talking about. Like, yes, we know that if something's not in time, it's not in time. And as a musician, we're able to tell that something's not in time. So playing late, really, also from all the experience I've had with playing with really great musicians, what it really is how they shape the beginning of the note. And so I've never thought about it this way, but yes, touch guitar is really it's a very immediate note, a very very immediate sound, and like I said, it's also very immediate because like any kind of a vibrato, any kind of movement you're putting into the string, it will be right there. Also, it's there when you're attacking the note. It's not like you're at first you have like this unified sound of say a pick, which and then you start like moving your finger. It's like you're moving the finger, and from the movement you're getting the vibrato. It's like one thing almost, and that really makes it something special. And I had one more thought about like building onto Nick's question really. When I joined the band Stickman with Tony Levin and Pat Mastelotto, I was facing this task because like they had a stick player in the band before me, and I was facing like this role, and I didn't really want to play the stick, or I didn't really want to play like the stick on my instrument in that band. So what happened is that I basically became a rock guitar player, which I had never done before. I have to say, or I never thought of myself as a rock guitar player. So I was then challenged by learning and by writing pieces that had a rock guitar part, and especially going back to because we play quite a few covers of like vintage King Crimson pieces. Like then being challenged to kind of recreate with the touch technique the sound of say something like the pick guitar part in Elephant Talk, like something really fast, tick 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 tick, and getting that kind of attack and the length of the notes exactly right so that it sounds like the part and has that same groove. And for example, Lux, Tongues, and Aspic. Well, at the beginning you have these chords and fourths and just kind of emulating the sound of the open strings that resonate when Robert Fripp plays that part on electric guitar. That was challenging, but it was also eye and ear opening to see that you really can, if you pay attention to detail, like the devil in the details, right? If you pay attention to that, you can find solutions. And you can emulate the sound of open strings. Like sometimes I would hold down a string and play with the other strings in order to get that dirt that would be missing. And so I find that there is and I'm just talking about myself here and what I see in the people that I work with. I think there's so much potential and we have just scratched the surface. And I'm talking about my group of people here, and I think we really need to learn a lot from Stanley. But what I'm saying is we're just about to understand how to write a fingering for a monophonic part. Jacob, who asked the question before, he's currently working on some Bach pieces, like cello, no, actually violin pieces, and we're slowly figuring out this idea, like when you were saying, okay, for a bass part, you kind of go between the hands so you can keep the constant attack, let's say. But there are also finger combinations that within the hand that can give you that sort of attack. But there are others that don't work as well. So if you combine all these probabilities, let's say, and you start weighing all these options that you have, then at some point some sort of unified technique may come about, and that's something that I'm working on with my students.
I'm also playing Maggot Brain, which is like on the other side of the spectrum and emulating those sounds, and that's like a totally different experience.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this discussion is something which is stemming from a guitar course that I'm currently taking and one that I currently finished, which is approaching the work as beginning again. We're always beginning again. We're always discovering a new thing. For example, in this discussion here, I've gleaned new information, which is making me rethink what was in my head before this discussion happened. And I just wanted to share that idea with everybody. And I wanted to chime in one thing that I put in the message board about recording oneself and listening to what one is playing. One of the best pieces of advice I was given, and this can apply to other things besides music, is to approach what one does as though one didn't do it. In other words, you record yourself, and then the next day or 2 days later, you listen to it, but you listen to it as though you just walked in the room and somebody asked you to listen to something. So you're listening to it as though you didn't actually do it. And you listen to it, or you approach the work in a totally different way. If you can, and it's not easy to do that, by the way, to step outside of oneself to do that. But when you do it, it's mind-blowing what happens. I mean, you'll discover things, or you might see mistakes that you never acknowledged before.
Yeah, for sure, Henry. Absolutely. Yeah, but like this act of dissociating yourself from whatever you did, that's something that can be practiced. So that's why I recommended to try that, to record yourself, and then maybe like with a 2-day lag, then listen to it. So allow a little bit of time, and then as you get better, maybe then you can listen right away. And yeah.
It's like proofreading. You can have a glaring mistake that you never notice, because every time you read that part, in your mind, you know what you meant to say, and you don't even notice what it actually says right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have about like 10 minutes left. It would be wonderful if we could use this opportunity to have more people ask questions, and I'd be happy to really answer some like also, I don't know, like personal ones. But I'm sure that there are many questions left about how this instrument kind of works, or what kind of different approaches there are. Just go ahead and ask some questions. Like we have Jonas, for example, who is just very new to the instrument. He just had his first lesson 2 weeks ago, and it's wonderful to see how well you're doing. Go ahead, and there's the opportunity to ask Stanley also.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Is my sound fine?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. For me, it's pretty mesmerizing, all the information going on in my head right now. That's why I'm kind of observing rather than giving my input. Just because you asked, I have one specific question regarding the tuning of the touch guitar. The upper two strings are tuned differently. I think it's a minor third and a second.
Mhm.
What's the reason for that exactly?
Uh, well, that's a good question. The reason is that I played an instrument that was the acoustic guitar that Robert Fripp had tuned for me, which was his so-called new standard tuning that I learned to play. And when I bought my first stick, which I got from Trey Gunn, he had used this a variation of that tuning on the top 5 strings of his stick. So it was tuned with fifth and the minor third on top, just like the guitars in Guitarcraft, and Trey was part of that school as well. And so I just started with that tuning, and it kind of made sense because I already knew it, and I could play some of that Guitarcraft repertoire that uses that relationship of the minor third on top, and it was just something that I did because it was. I didn't know otherwise, right? I just had to start somewhere. So, but then the interesting thing that happened was that Mark Warr started building 8-string touch guitars. That was around 95, I think. And I remember seeing a photo of Trey with this famous black TSG-8 that some of you have seen in Seattle when we had a seminar there. I saw that in a photograph and I thought, oh, that's the kind of instrument I want. And I called Mark Warr and I ordered one. And back then it didn't take that long to get an instrument. It maybe was half a year or something. I can't remember exactly. And I got it, and I didn't specify the tuning really when I ordered it. And then I had this idea to kind of keep the middle the middle 6 strings in the new standard tuning that I had used with Fripp in Guitarcraft. So what I did is, because obviously it's a bass scale instrument, so I said, okay, let's take the 5th fret, and on the 5th fret I want to have the same tuning on the middle 6 strings. And then obviously at the bottom, I put a lower 5th. And at the top, because it was already up to a C, which is pretty high, like the first string then became a D, because that was as far as I could go, really. And it turned out later that Trey, who I hadn't talked to at that time, he had come up with the exact same solution. So it was like, at that point, it was 2 people using that tuning. And for me, that was kind of like a sign. Like, how do 2 people come up with the same solution? I mean, now I think it's kind of obvious, because that's the only thing that really worked without changing the whole thing around. But now I find it great, because you have 3 strings that have close interval relationships at the top, where you can play chords with one hand. It's not that I do that very much. I mean, I think I use these voicings like more in a melodic way, usually, not as chords, but it basically integrates so well, because everything is still an open tuning. Like the way that I think of it, in the 2nd fret, like the 1st fret, you can really play well on the instrument. If you just bar there, then it's just white keys, right? It's just white keys, so it's kind of nice. The 1st string is the same note as the 4th string, so you have the octave there. So it's very easy to kind of grab an octave, like here, like this, with one hand in the same fret, and you have. And this is kind of more difficult to understand how it could be useful, but between the 2nd and the 6th string, you have 2 octaves, and that means that the top 2 strings are not new strings; they are just higher versions of strings that you already have in the arrangement of all fifths of an all fifths tuning, and that turned out to be really, really useful and really great tuning. And for me, it's the one tuning that I just want to work with till the end of my life, I have to admit. A lot of things are very difficult to play in it. Some things are really, I would say, close to impossible. I say that from this perspective, maybe in 5 years it will be different. But I just love the sound of it, and it actually for me it was like a blank slate. You know, it was just that famous white wall that I could throw colors at. It was different than I don't have any background with American music or jazz music. You know, I grew up with more like the classical European tradition, where it's more about like individual notes and you combine them to create a chord or a sound, and it was not so much about recreating. And I don't mean this in a bad way, but not so much about like recreating the sound of jazz, where it's very much about the sound and the attitude of it. So for me, the fifth tuning was just more more neutral, and also, and this is something that we haven't really gotten into much. So the system that I've come up with, which most of you really most of you have heard of, is this pentachord system, where basically the 8 fingers of 2 hands cover 8 chromatic notes. So like from C to G. And this is kind of this framework of lowest note in one hand on the first finger and highest note on the other hand on the pinky. That becomes sort of a system that opens up the whole fretboard and is an incredible tool to learn the fretboard very quickly. Something that has, again, like from my observations over the years, has been one of the major limiting factors to people. Like, it's really, I have new students who have had an instrument for 20 years, and I ask them to play an A, and it takes them a minute to find an A. I'm not joking, and I just find that unacceptable. Because it hurts me that an instrument doesn't allow people to really learn these basics, and that has and like part of my, if you want to say so, mission has become to give people a tool to actually go get past that first hurdle and to have a good orientation on the fretboard and know that you know where your C's are, and also to know where your E flats are. And it's happening very quickly once you have a grip on like the first few notes, let's say. But with instruments that have more than 8 strings, I found that is like a major hurdle for people, and especially with when having 4th and 5th on the same instrument. Even though it's kind of logical, you say, okay, yeah, it's the same pitch, it's mirrored, but it just goes into the other direction because the 4th inverts to a 5th and the 5th inverts to a 4th. But even though that's logical, that's not how a human brain functions. Yeah, you have to break it down to this level of it being a shape, let's say, before it makes sense to the human mind. And it's not something that just is natural. And I found that the approach to put your 2 hands on one string really is the starting point. And actually, like one of the most basic exercises, again, a lot of you guys know it, is what I call the daughter exercise. It's the second exercise after the son exercise. The daughter exercise means you play one note in one fret on one string with all 8 fingers. So you want to be able to reach, in the end, to reach every single note, every single fret, every single string on the instrument with all 8 fingers. And that is kind of like the foundation of how I approach the instrument and how I want to keep approaching it. And it turns out to actually work. I just had, when the lockdown started, I started to practice a little bit, and I started practicing with things that Wolfgang, who also is listening, I think, was doing. I just started playing just simple 2-octave scales with this pentachord system in 2 octaves and in thirds. Okay, and I tried to just bring that up to speed. And I had no musical application for that, really. I had no aim. It was just for the sake of the movement and for the sake of getting having the sensation of actually learning, like the art of learning it itself, without actually having an aim or a specific application. And then now that I have started playing live again, and I played this really just really small concert for 25 people on Saturday night, also over Zoom and using a streaming service. What happened was that I realized by this practice of those scales, suddenly my hands, and this is something that I'm sure Stanley can say something about, like suddenly the hands or the fingers really know where to go without you even having to think, because the fingers or the hands get connected to the ear in such a way that the actual thought process can be bypassed. And once we get to that kind of facility on an instrument, then I feel that whatever greater thing there is, like just the creative energy can flow through us and can come out through the instrument. And that is really like, I hope that I manage to pass this on to people. Okay, so now for last questions. Or Stanley, if you want to say something, it's fine. Yeah, Hacksaw. Hey, your mic is.
So the question that I had, sort of going back to what Stanley was saying about the instrument being clearer as it was coming out, and jumping forward in the speaker, is there anything that you find foundational in either your effects chain or your mixing chain that you have to do differently from a normal guitar? I kind of understand normal guitar stuff, but obviously the attack being so different and the entire playing sequence being different means that the foundations might be different. So I was wondering about that.
Yeah, that's a big subject, and we're actually going to cover that in my workshop. But let me just tell you a few things right now. Okay, so one thing, remember I was talking about how I think the tone is simpler because you don't have
right.
different waves. And so one of the things that I do is I often use a delay, and I don't always turn it up really loud. You don't generally notice the delay, but it's there just to sort of fatten up the tone and give me that other, phase of my same sound. And
right.
It does make the sound kind of more solid, more robust in the mix. Another thing is when you're doing two-hand stuff and you got your left hand down here and you got your right hand up here, a big issue that often comes up is that the left hand is playing these chords, and then the right hand has a hard time competing. That one note has a hard time competing against all these other notes here. And if you give yourself a little boost at 2.5K, bring out all these notes that are in that sort of second octave above the middle C octave. It's going to bring those notes out. So that can be really, really helpful. Then one other thing is sometimes I'll use compression. Like generally when I play, I don't use exclusively touch technique. So sometimes I'll strum or I'll use other techniques with it, and the other techniques are much louder. And so what I'll do is I'll put a compressor on just to catch those loud points. And so what it does is it allows me to still play the touch technique with dynamics, but then when I just go to whack the shit out of it, it doesn't blow out my speakers. So I generally, what I find works best with that is I put a pretty high threshold, but a pretty steep compression ratio. So it's almost a limiter. It's just really just catching all the stuff that's just way too.
Right.
Yeah, and I have something to add from like again, playing with Stickman, I started developing these really extremely high gain sounds that I loved so much from my idols, Mike Oldfield and Robert Fripp, that kind of style, which I like with endless sustain and stuff. And I built this whole collection of sounds to play the Stickman set. And then at some point, people started asking me, well, will you make available your presets, your patches for the Helix? And I just can't do that because it just doesn't work with any regular guitar. It's really such a different. It sounds really bad when used with a regular guitar, and I'm still marveling at that fact. But it really is so different that the processing doesn't really take away that difference. It actually magnifies it, and that has been like really a fascinating learning curve. Understanding that even like again, like speaking of my friend Tony Levin, right? He hardly ever, only maybe sometimes at home when he records, is he actually using an amp for the stick. He's always just using the direct signal. On stage, he just plugs the instrument directly into the desk through a DI box, right? And that's the sound. With any other bass instrument, you wouldn't do that. I mean, you can, and like with bass, some people still do that. But that amp sound that really you need to sculpt the overall frequency, it just works with the technique of plugging the strings. But with a touch instrument, something in a way gets lost or gets added in such a way that it just makes it sometimes even annoying. So and maybe like just even finding a nice crunch sound for when playing touch, it requires a lot of research. And even though, I mean, you could say, okay, that's a disadvantage. I personally find that to be advantageous because, like, if you're really into doing it, you have to find a solution, and you will find a solution that's different from everybody else's solution somehow, and that just adds to your uniqueness. So, but anyway, it's really, yeah. I wouldn't give away my Helix patches. You guys wouldn't like it, or them. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, guys. So my throat is pretty dry, and I'm so happy to meet you, Stanley. It was just a wonderful introduction to you and your personality and your warmth. Yeah, like everybody clap their hands, but it's hard to hear. Thank you very much, Stanley. And I encourage everybody to check out Stanley's course. And Stanley, maybe can you post a link into the chat here?
Yeah, so sorry for my shameless plug here, but I'm
No, it's much appreciated.
okay. For convenience, I just posted one more time. So that's the link to the course. Now the course, you know, it's a premium course, so there's a charge for that separately, but there's also we also have subscription content on demand, and I'm putting a lot of stuff in there. I have for example, there's a library of guitar chord charts for P4 tuning, and it's got 570,000 pages of chord charts. So there's a lot of stuff. I don't have the breadth yet that I'm looking for, but there's a lot of depth into it.
Yes.
And so some of it, there's some content that's free too, and then there's some content that's like a monthly subscription, and you can do the subscription through the Patreon page, which you can find from the main page of the school. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stanley. Okay, does anybody want to say something, or I think we're done here. And yeah, I have to say I always appreciate donations in the form of music sales from my Bandcamp page. So if you haven't, I mean, most of you buy my stuff anyway, so it's kind of redundant to say that, but please support musicians. You're all musicians yourself, and maybe some of you still have a day job, and if you can support musicians, please do. Creative people, like Dean was saying, like his day job, or he's an artist working with potatoes. And so just let's see how we can all kind of help each other. And I hope you enjoyed this. Oh, what's that? Oh, it's a potato. Yeah. Or let's see how we can all get through this. And I hope that this episode of edutainment was actually entertaining and informative. And as some of you already know, I'm going to do an event every single week, and I'm trying to change the topic and like the form of it every time. So I have no idea what I'm going to do next week, but I'll let you know. Yeah. Okay.
I want to give, again, Markus's recording with Gary Husband a plug, because if those of you out there haven't heard it or haven't, it is recommended highly from myself. It is an exercise in sublimity, beauty, pathos. It covers so much ground, and
He laughed, he cried.
No, I'm serious. It is. It really is a masterful work. I've been listening to it for a week. I'm not kidding anybody here. It has been on constant rotation.
Right.
I'm studying it. It's got so much to give, and I just highly recommend it. And that would be one way to support Markus, is get that recording, man.
Hey, Henry, thank you so much. And yes, you're okay, thanks everybody. Yeah, see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.